Bitcoin for all.
Now that you understood how Bitcoin time chain works and that it needs consensus from the participants for decentralized coordination, let's understand how the network agrees with each other through a mechanism called proof of work. Bitcoin mining is an analogy for the process of searching for something precious like gold, except that in the Bitcoin network that something precious is the hash of each block. When it comes to gold, miners keep digging until they find the precious metal. Once they do, they have something scarce and valuable in their hands. Gold is scarce, and through time it gets harder and more expensive to mine it, since digging deeper and deeper into the ground is needed. Gold mining requires increasingly modern and efficient equipment to access the deepest and most complex deposits. Something very similar happens with Bitcoin. In the Bitcoin network, miners compete with each other through trial and error to see who gets the hash that closes each block of information first. Remember that a block is made up of several components: the hash of the previous block, a timestamp, and all the transaction data. Along with this information, there is also a piece of information called nonce. Nonce stands for number used only once. When miners use computing power to mine the block, it means that they are at an absurd computational speed trying to find that number that can only be used once by the network. That's the number that all the miners are competing to find. The block header contains the hash that mixes several components: the hash of the previous block, the timestamp, the root transaction that summarizes all the transactions that enter the block, and the nonce. A good analogy for this mining process is a jigsaw puzzle. So in this analogy, Bitcoin mining is like a puzzle, a game, in which the miners need to find the missing piece to complete the picture every 10 minutes. Everyone is looking for the right piece within all the possibilities, and whoever finds it first tries to fit it into the picture. When the miner finds the missing piece, it's very easy to everyone see if it fits. Just look at the picture and see if the piece was correct or not. This means that mining is a process that is difficult to defraud and at the same time very easy to verify. Just like a piece in a jigsaw puzzle. It's difficult to find the correct piece, but easy to check whether it was the missing piece or not. Bitcoin is like a global puzzle in which the whole world participates and follows the results in real time. The entire mining and consensus process when registering the Bitcoin blockchain works like this. Miners use computing power, buying powerful machines with huge computational power to try and find the nonce of the block as quickly as possible. When they find it, they create the hash, show it to the network, and the nodes verify if the proposed block is following the rules. If everything is okay, the block is added into the blockchain and propagated through the network. The block is inserted into all participants' copies of the blockchain. Afterwards, the miners receive Bitcoin as a reward for completing the task. This whole process is known as proof of work. Proof of work means that the miner has followed the rules, found the nonce, created the block hash, and provided a computational service to the network. When all the information of the block is found, it goes through the encryption process of turning the information into a cryptographic puzzle using SHA-256. The result is this huge number which represents the hash of the block, the result of miners' work. This process is not exclusive to Bitcoin, but to anything that can be encrypted. SHA-256 is the algorithm that does this. The SHA-256 takes information of any length and creates a sequence of 256 zeros and ones. From this huge number full of zeros and ones, the algorithm creates an hexadecimal sequence made up of 64 digits, both letters and numbers, and that is easier to write down. In other words, it's easy to verify that the sequence is correct, but it's practically impossible to forge the encrypted information. Trying to randomly match a hash and break the SHA-256 encryption is practically impossible. It involves an absurdly high number of possible combinations, more numbers than the number of the atoms in the observable universe. This would require so many attempts that would take a normal computer billions of years to do it. That's where the story of the quantum computer comes in. People always ask us if a quantum computer could break Bitcoin's encryption. This is one of the great hopes of Bitcoin haters, but the truth that no quantum computer would be able to kill Bitcoin. I will add a link of an article that explains this in the description of this lesson. Now it's time to show you a very cool website. It's this one called Code Beautify. This site allows you to experiment and convert any information into a SHA-256 function. Let's type Bitcoin for all here. See how the code in the box below changes with every letter, space, or punctuation mark? This is what happens to the Bitcoin's network's block hash if any information is modified. Note how fast it happened. It didn't require mega computing power to find this hash. If this was that easy to create a hash right here in this website, why does it take 10 minutes on the Bitcoin network on average? And why is no longer possible to mine from your home computer? This has to do with a mechanism called difficulty adjustment. The difficulty adjustment has the role to auto-regulate the issuance of new Bitcoin. It is this adjustment that ensures that the average time taken to create new blocks followed by the reward delivered by the network is 10 minutes. This is because every 2016 blocks mined, about 15 days on average, there is an algorithm that analyzes the amount of computing power in the network and increase or decrease the difficulty of finding the block hash. If the number of miners suddenly increases and so computing power of the network increases too, the network will regulate itself to increase the difficulty of mining so as not to speed up the rate at which new blocks are created and consequently not speed up the rate at which new Bitcoin are created. It works like this. As more miners join the network or more machines are competing to mine a block, the hash rate increases, the rate at which new blocks are created. Miners start to find blocks more easily, and the average mining time between one block and the next becomes faster. The network realizes this through its algorithms and increases the difficulty of mining. As a result, the speed of creating new blocks drops, since it has become more difficult for miners to find blocks, until it stabilizes at an average of 10 minutes between one block and another. This is how the network regulates itself as demand increases, so it never loses its predictability. You can tell the difficulty level of mining each block by the number of zeros that appear before the block's hash number. This block, for example, has 24 zeros in front of the hash code. It was mined in October 2022, being one of the most difficult blocks to mine at the time. Miners' goal is to assemble a block where the hash code is smaller than the current target. The smaller the target, the harder it is to find a valid block. The more miners on the network, the harder this search gets. The more zeros leading a hash, the harder it is to mine, requiring more effort for a miner to search and find a block's nonce. It's because of the difficulty adjustment that mining has evolved, and it's no longer so easy to mine from your home PC or your home computer or from a CPU. Today, Bitcoin is mined using specific machines called ASICs. As the price of Bitcoin rose, it ended up attracting more and more people with more computing power being employed in the network. With it, the difficulty adjustment algorithm was increased to maintain an average of one block mined every 10 minutes. As the level of difficulty increased, the more tech-savvy people began to use more powerful machines like GPUs, which are widely used in gaming computers, and Bitcoin continued to attract more and more people wanting to mine, until a machine was created to this specific purpose, the ASICs. This type of machine is much more powerful and beats CPUs and GPUs at the speed of finding the block's hash. Mining has become a giant and dedicated industry, tirelessly seeking efficiency. In other words, it aims to produce as many as Bitcoin possible with as little energy as possible. In this case, the price doesn't matter. Bitcoin could reach $10 billion and the speed at which new Bitcoin are issued does not change. Even an increase in the hash rate cannot lead to more Bitcoin being issued than it's planned for each halving cycle. Bringing more miners into the network doesn't produce more Bitcoin, but it does make the network more secure. And why does this mechanism make the network more secure? Well, because the greater the computing power, the harder it is to attack the network. In this graph, the line represents the hash rate, the computing power, and the redder colors represent the difficulty of mining each block. The difficulty and hash rate have increased exponentially since Bitcoin began. As the line turns orange, the harder it is to mine a block. The greater the computing power, the more the network has adapted to protect Bitcoin's properties. That's why Bitcoin has no competitor in mining. It's the protocol with the most miners distributed around the planet and the most computing power of all. Bitcoin is 631 times more powerful than the world's 500 largest supercomputers combined, represented in the white line. Bitcoin is shown in the orange line. Bitcoin has the most attack-resistant computer network, 600 times stronger than any centralized computer system or data center. But the advance of mining hasn't stopped at ASICs. Over time, even with an extremely powerful machine, it became harder and harder to find blocks. As a response, the miners ended up grouping together in pools. They pooled their computing power to have a better chance of finding blocks and sharing the reward. Mining pools work between Bitcoin software and the miners, allowing miners to pool the computing power of their machines and have a better chance of finding a block. The term pool designates a pool of computing power. To give you an idea of how difficult it is to mine outside a pool, to mine solo an S19J Pro, which is one of the most modern ASICs machines, it has a 0.000000208% chance of mining a Bitcoin block. That's one chance in almost 4.8 billion attempts over the entire lifetime of the machine, which lasts an average of 5 to 8 years. This probability will continue to decrease over time as more miners arrive. The hash rate rises and the difficulty increases. That's why pools work like a system where everyone chips in with computing power. Whenever someone finds a block, everyone shares the reward in Bitcoin in proportion to their hashing power. This way, miners can earn a frequent income instead of hoping to find a block on their own, which can take years and it's not guaranteed to happen at all. Nowadays, the Bitcoin network has dozens of pools, but 5 of them are the largest and aggregate most of the hash rate: Foundry and Pool F2 Pool, via BTC and Mara. Although many people say that this could be classified as a centralization mechanism, in reality miners can leave the pool at any time and go to another one. They can even mine solo if they want to try their luck. The concentration of these 5 largest pools was a natural market movement of the miners' will to stay in pools with greater odds of finding blocks and share the rewards. The pools don't run the network, since it's the nodes that verify and decide whether the mined blocks are valid or not. Another essential point in the functioning of Bitcoin is the halving, which has everything to do with mining. As time goes by, Bitcoin becomes more and more scarce. Growing scarcity, coupled with growing demand, is what causes Bitcoin's parabolic upward price movements. It's the halving that causes Bitcoin to gradually become scarcer and at the same time create cycles of appreciation that have been repeated. Halving comes from the word halving. The Bitcoin halving means that for every 210,000 blocks mined, every 4 years on average, the protocol cuts the reward given to miners in half. The first halving took place on November 28, 2012, at the very beginning of the network. At the time, the Bitcoin network produced 15 Bitcoin per block of information processed. In other words, for every 10 minutes on average on that time, miners received 50 Bitcoin as a reward. With the 2012 halving, miners were paid 25 Bitcoin per mined block. In 2016, the second halving took place in the 420,000 block, and the emission was halved again. Instead of receiving 25 Bitcoin per block, each miner received 12.5 Bitcoin per block. The third halving took place in 2020 in May 11 and in block 630,000, and from then on, miners received 6.25 Bitcoin per block until the next halving in 2024. The last halving, the fourth, took place in April 2024 at the block 840,000, and the next one will be in 2028. The best thing about all of this is that we know in advance which block is going to be at the time of the 1.50 million block. The new reward will be 1.5625 Bitcoin for miners. This image shows how at each halving I step upwards of the orange line. Bitcoin is slowly becoming scarcer and approaching the unit supply limit in the blue line. That's quite an amazing image. It illustrates how Bitcoin is transparent, programmable, and has a predictable monetary policy that cannot be expanded or modified. These aspects are very different from other assets or currencies that change their rules or monetary policies at any time. The last Satoshi will be mined in the year 2140. That's when the issuance of new Bitcoin will end. Network fees will be the only source of revenue for miners to pay for operating costs. This table here is another way of showing the same thing. This table shows Bitcoin's entire monetary policy, from the first Satoshi and the first halving to the last halving in 2140. We can see that 90% of the Bitcoin have already been issued, and that by the year 2036, 99% of all Bitcoin to ever exist will have been mined. The rest, the final 1%, will be created between 2036 and 2140. It takes 110 years to mine 1% of the Bitcoin supply. The year 2030 is probably when the biggest source of income for miners will be the fees. At this point, Bitcoin's demand should be very high, to the point where the fees charged by miners sustain their operation, including machine maintenance and energy costs, instead of depending on the block reward. When we talk about 2140, there's always a fear of the unknown and doubt. What happens when the last Bitcoin is mined? The answer is nothing. This great change begins much earlier, by 2030. Fees will tend to be the main source of income by miners. By the time of 2140 arrives, miners will probably be receiving much more in fees than the few satoshis offered by the network due to the increasing scarcity of the currency, the rising prices of fiat, and the increased use of the network. And why is the halving so important? Halvings create a supply shock. Fewer Bitcoins become available while demand remains the same. With each halving, the number of Bitcoin created per block is cut in half. This reduces supply, which pushes up the price. If a lot of people want to buy Bitcoin and you can't create more units, the only way to convince hodlers to sell is to offer a higher price. Hodlers are Bitcoiners who accumulate Bitcoin for the long term and don't sell even in the big short-term falls. The term hodler became a meme because a guy on Bitcoin Talk, a famous Bitcoin forum, misspelled it and people adopted the slang to differentiate from the traditional stock market crowd. This image is a screenshot of the post that gave hodlers their name, Bitcoiners who hold Bitcoin tightly and don't sell at all. This rise forms parabolic movements and attracts everyone's attention. Bitcoin makes the news, further increasing demand, and that's when hallucination, euphoria, and the bull run begins. This is because the only way to have the same liquidity to satisfy new buyers is to increase the premium so that those who have Bitcoin change their minds and want to sell. It's the simplest law of economics, the law of supply and demand. If there is too much demand and supply is reduced, prices rise. As the number of Bitcoin is limited to 21 million units and there is no way to issue more, when demand increases, the only way for supply to meet demand is for the price to rise. Halvings cause supply shocks that make Bitcoin's price to rise until a new price breakthrough. This whole process creates cyclical movements of appreciation and contraction until the new price is set. Bitcoin cycles are made up of 4 phases. The first phase is the bear, when the market is bearish. This is when the price falls sharply after a period of highs and those who join the boom leave. 2011, 2014, 2018, and 2022 were Bitcoin's bear years. That's when only negative news comes out and those who were tourists in Bitcoin leave. Following the bear comes a very agonizing phase, which is the accumulation phase, which is when Bitcoin goes sideways for a whole year. Nothing happens, it's pure boredom, and it never seems to end. The next phase is the expansion or growth phase. That's when Bitcoin starts to rise slowly without a peak. This is the phase in which the haters attack because they don't believe in a new rise and Bitcoiners begin to renew their hopes that a new bull run is on the horizon. 2011, 2016, 2020, 2024 were years of expansion. And finally comes the bull run. That's when Bitcoin reaches peak of the cycle and runs like an unbridled bull. Nothing can hold it back. This phase is pure joy and euphoria. Even the haters disappear. Bitcoin is the talk of the town, attracting everyone's attention and reaching new price levels. When the euphoria wears off, the fall comes, a new price floor is established, and so it all goes back to the beginning, to the bear phase. It's a mental and emotional roller coaster. So much so that the Fear and Greed Index was created just to measure the emotional state of the market. The closer to zero it gets, the closer the sentiment is to extreme fear, while approaching to 100 represents approaching extreme greed. People generally want Bitcoin to appreciate in a straight line, but Bitcoin's biggest rises took a year to reach the apex of the movement. Let's take a closer look to analyze Bitcoin's price following the halvings. From the halving to the top of the cycle, it has taken about a year to hit a new all-time high. The chart fluctuates a lot, but with an average upward rise in value. Bitcoin appreciated 11,000% after the first halving, 2,500% after the second halving, and 1,000% after the third halving in 2020, when it reached at least the all-time high at $69,000. The fourth halving took place in 2024, and Bitcoin has already hit $100,000. And those who live to see will know how far the price can go this cycle. But everything that goes up has to come down. Although Bitcoin's great rises in value have diminished their intensity over the years, the same has happened with the falls. In 2012, Bitcoin had a brutal drop of 92%. After the first halving, it dropped at 84%. In the second halving, it fell 84% again. In the last halving, the drop was 77%, lower than the previous bears. This means that over time, Bitcoin is becoming less volatile. Of course, it's a long way from moving in straight line, but we can already notice this trend. What can also be observed is that Bitcoin has had increasingly higher lows throughout the cycles. In 2012, one Bitcoin was worth less than $1. By 2014, the minimum was already $10. In 2016, it was worth $100. In 2019, $1,000. And in 2022, $10,000. This means that as much as Bitcoin falls a lot, it has maintained higher and higher minimum prices over time. But will it always be like this? Will Bitcoin continue to appreciate forever? This is the subject to the next lesson. Now that you've learned how Bitcoin works and the history of Bitcoin cycles, it's time to understand why it tends to keep growing in the long term. So see you there.